We do not have empirical evidence that there are other living creatures of any type in the universe. But I definitely am optimistic. Our whole Christian tradition has agreed that if God creates something, it's good. So that's a good theological reason for having positive expectations about meeting other intelligent creatures.
Are we alone in the universe? Does it matter? And how does that affect our theology? Well, hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Ted Peters, who I'm really excited to welcome to the show because this is a topic I've been looking forward to talking about for a while. So thank you, Ted, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to have this conversation.
Josh, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad you're talking about things that other people don't talk about.
Well, that is our mission here, is to talk about things, politics, religion, and aliens, I guess, can be added onto that list of things that sometimes, especially Christians, they decide, to kind of push to the back of their minds because it's a little bit tricky to figure out how that would work in the context of our regular theology, which is, pretty earth-centered. I'm sure you would agree. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and, your area of expertise and what you've studied and write about?
Well, Josh, I'm a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and living and teaching in Berkeley. I've been for some decades, a professor of theology and ethics at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And here we have a marvelous, perhaps even unique institution called the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. And because we're adjacent to the University of California, we have more scientists than Orange County has orange trees. And
wow.
So we have a wonderful opportunity to engage on various topics. With regard to UFOs and aliens, it's one of my favorite topics. I was the expert in my neighborhood in the 7th grade on flying saucers. And, so I continue right down to the present day doing both investigation, interviewing people with UFO experiences, as well as engaging in theological reflection. There's not much of that going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Josh, I'm really glad that you're willing to tackle this one.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for you joining me for this conversation because, like you said, reflecting on it and thinking about it is something that we need more of in these times where It seems like every week there's a breaking news story about, this has been discovered in the desert and that's been reported in the airspace, So without further ado, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about maybe just a broad overview of how you think extraterrestrial life can, I guess, live harmoniously within a Christian theology? Because a lot of people watching will probably think, I don't know if those things can coexist.
Well, let me cut the pie into two large slices. One is what I call astrotheology, in which Christian thinkers engage in dialogue with astronomers, astrophysicists, and astrobiologists, the SETI people, search for extraterrestrial intelligence in particular. Let me say that's one whole conversation. Then a second one is the UFO community, those who have had experiences with unidentified flying objects and think that they come courtesy of extraterrestrial intelligences who are visiting Earth either to investigate us or at least they're just, on summer vacation and they want to tour our planet. So those are the two different areas, but they converge on the question that you're asking: how should Christians think? And before we get into the should, what do Christians think?
Right.
Well, I asked them. I conducted, with the help of a graduate student, Julie Freilich, what's called the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. We wanted to know would your faith suffer a crisis if we could confirm that intelligent creatures living on an exoplanet share our universe and God's creation with us? The response was really quite clear that by far and away, we're talking about 85-90% of those polled would say, no, my faith will not be challenged. And we're talking about self-identified Roman Catholics. We're talking about mainline Protestants. The evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants were in the same group. We didn't distinguish them. They also hold exactly the same position. And when asked for comments, they would say, well, I read the Bible literally, and I think God's universe is big enough for more than just little old us. And
I guess maybe Christians are a little more stubborn than I give them credit for, because I thought more people would have had a few doubts about all that.
Well, I have tried to find those who do have the doubts, and my observation is that there are a few pastors and theologians, mostly Protestant, but some Eastern Orthodox too, who want to say aliens are not in the Bible, therefore they don't exist, and Satan is trying to fool us into believing that evolution has taken place on other planets, and therefore this fiction of talking about evolved or more highly evolved aliens is a satanic trick. So I just want to say that view is clearly there, and it's in the literature, and you can get it on the websites. But by far and away, the majority, even very conservative Protestant Christians as well as conservative Catholics, no problem.
Well, I think, this would be a good time for me to probably, nail my colors to the mast and say that I probably would fit a little closer to the latter group than the prior group. Not that my faith would be rocked per se, but I would probably naturally have an inclination to be extremely suspicious that, maybe perhaps there were supernatural things at play that were not as clear as they would seem. But I'm not necessarily fixed on that at all, and part of the reason why I'm having this conversation is to explore that from the perspective of trying to learn more about how these things can coexist, because whether I come out of this conversation or anyone watching it comes out with a changed mind is up to each individual person. But the best thing I can do is to hold out the information and say, well, here's how we can perhaps square this circle when we look at the Bible and look at things that, who knows, could happen 10, 100, 1,000 years in the future. We don't know what way things are going to go.
Right.
So the biggest question that I naturally would have kind of arising from that, I suppose primarily number one is, does that diminish how special the creation is on Earth compared to, if there was life on every other planet in the galactic neighborhood?
Well, let's think this one through, because the question you ask is one that a number of people ask, especially critics of religion, want to say, and they call it actually the Copernican principle. We discovered Earth is not in the center, we are only marginal, therefore we're insignificant, and stop it, you Christians, saying that we're the pinnacle, the human race is the pinnacle of creation. Well, we get Psalm 8, which is one of my favorite psalms, and it begins with how majestic is God, and just God's fingers create and move the sun and the stars and the moon and everything. And then that paradoxical twist, but what is the human race that you care about us? We're so small. We're so insignificant. So I think that that could help us in speaking to this question, even if it turns out that physically in this creation, Earth is small and marginal. That doesn't mean we're not important to God.
That's true.
And it just strikes me that I don't have to think that the value of the human race to God is diminished by our relative smallness in the cosmos. That's my way of thinking, at any rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way, but when you think about it, it's the same argument that people make when they're like, "Why am I important when there's 7 billion other people on the planet?
Yes,
You know, why
that's
should
right.
God?" And going back as well to him caring about the sparrow. You know, why should he care about
Yes, when Jesus says, "Look, the sparrow. Aren't you
Mm-hmm.
more important than the sparrow? Come on, get over
Right.
it."
So there's the ability that God can hold all created beings of importance, no matter I guess where they reside in the in the universe, But I hadn't thought about it that way. It's an interesting perspective and an interesting way to look at it. Do you think that when it says that God created people in His image, does that mean that aliens would have to look like us, or is it a more metaphorical way of like being intelligent beings, or could you see, if something that looked like a squid came down from the sky, would that we'd find it hard to see them as our brothers in Christ, if you know what I mean?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is dig around a little bit and ask what we mean by the image of God, or imago Dei, in Latin. And our tradition has more than one idea going around. The word image in imago Dei in Genesis 1:26 to 29, for example, it is a metaphor because kings and emperors in the time in which Genesis was written would actually put an image of them in the town square. And
Or an
when
idol.
important news was to be announced, you and I would go to the town square, and we'd stand by the image of the emperor or the king. So that's the metaphor that is at work there. But over the years, we've tried to figure out, well, could it mean more than that? Could it mean our moral sensibility of the difference between right and wrong? No, it couldn't be that. That's what the serpent tempted Eve for.
Right.
So it's not that. What about our capacity to love one another, especially in difficulties? And so we've got a long list. Now, one that has emerged over the centuries is intelligence, reason, rationality. And this became really important for the birth of science. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton were all devout Christians. They believe that God thinks rationally, God creates the cosmos according to rational principles, and you and I, with our rational minds, can read the very mind of God by looking at the laws of nature. So that's the imago Dei, and that seems to be the dominant view. It's not my view, but it is the dominant view, and that's one of the reasons why looking for intelligent aliens seems to be more important than looking for microbes.
I was just thinking that, it's there seems to be a focus on intelligence over just life in general.
Yeah, and I think there's probably some good reason for Christian thinkers to ask about intelligence, but we know that intelligence can be used for evil as well as for good. Intelligence or reason is not intrinsically good, even if it's oriented towards the good, to be sure. So I think that for the most part, those who speculate on these issues tacitly use intelligence or reason as the imago Dei, and if we find intelligent creatures on another planet, then they will have the imago Dei because they think rationally. Of course, if we meet them, we might find out that they're really experts in music and poetry and art.
Is there a difference between that ability to reason? Because we see that exhibited in, I guess you could say the the smarter primates and mammals, and even dogs and cats have reason to an extent in that they know, I mean, my dog knows when he's done something bad, for example. He can tell by body language, or he knows his actions will have a consequence to a limited extent. So what would be the thing that, in your opinion, would differentiate between an image bearer and something with marginal intelligence that has reasoning capabilities?
Well, let's lay out a couple more possibilities. I think we may be misled a little bit by the scientific community, because when it studies other animals on our planet, it's always looking for intelligence, right? And you mentioned the primates, and there are 3 or 4 species of primates which are very close to human beings: the orangutans and the bonobos and the chimpanzees, etc., measured by intelligence. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I'm sick right now. I'm suffering from an infection. So I'm laying down in my bed. My dog, Angie, comes up on the bed, crawls up on my chest, and gives me her leather chewy. I perceive that she's caring for me. She's trying to show love to me, And I don't know as though any scientists try to measure that, love and compassion in animals. I don't know if they're always looking for intelligence. So I think if you and I were to meet an extraterrestrial, we might really be excited about how intelligent they are, but how kind are they? We're going to ask that question.
Yep.
And I think the fulfillment of the image of God, as Christians think about it based on the New Testament, is going to have a whole lot to do with love in one fashion or another. I don't know how to measure that, but it's definitely going to be important when we start engaging with extraterrestrials.
Yeah, it seems like to me, thinking about it, that the thing that differentiates us from the animals is, not necessarily. I mean, intelligence is one aspect for sure. I think in a lot of ways, some animals may even be more caring than humans, and more. It's potentially even more self-sacrificial in some instances than humans are.
Yeah.
But perhaps it's this ability to be in communion with God and with the Holy Spirit that is the big differentiator. So, I mean, I don't know how you would measure whether an extraterrestrial can be in communion with God or not.
Now, I have a colleague whose thesis is unique on this, and his name is Joshua Moritz, and he's both a biologist as well as an evangelical theologian. He says that the image of God that you and I share as human beings is due strictly to the fact that God has called us from among all the animals to be the one to bear the image. So it's really not a quality that we share, moral quality or a physical quality. It's the sheer fact that God has called the human race to be the bearer of the divine image in history. So if you were to work with that and meet an extraterrestrial, the question would be, did God call you too or not? And it would probably take a while to figure out the answer to that question. So just because they're intelligent doesn't automatically mean, they're bearers of the divine image.
That's true. Yeah, it would be strange to share a universe with intelligent beings that didn't bear the image of God. Could you imagine, some of these council meetings at first when they're getting together and trying to, decide whose God's the real one, and they think we're fake and we think their God's fake, and I can only imagine trying to figure that out. But it is an important question that intelligence doesn't necessarily represent that status, like you said, of being an image bearer of God, and that is all linked, I suppose, to how valuable we are to God, in that we would say that Jesus is, he died for us, for our sins, for salvation. And could that be said for beings on another planet? How would that play out?
Well, I know that on your list of questions here is atonement. Does Jesus's death and resurrection, atoning for your and my sins, would that apply to an off-Earth civilization that may have never had any historical contact with Jesus of Nazareth? It's a really, it's a really heavy question. And one of the ways that our theologians have formulated it is, should we expect that an intelligent species living on Zeta 2 Reticuli or some other off-Earth planet, would they have an incarnation in their history like we have in our history or not? And I've had some fun, actually, asking theologians, come on, think this one through, and divided it in two: those who believe in multiple incarnations and those who believe in only one. And here's my analysis. If, as you said before, Jesus' death and resurrection atones for your and my sins, and that changes history, I think you're going to tend towards one incarnation. And it happened here on Earth. Doesn't make Earth more important than other places, but it happened here on Earth. It happened once, and it's good for eternity. If, however, you think that Jesus' principal mission is to reveal the grace and love of God, then you're more likely to affirm multiple incarnations. And great theologians such as Paul Tillich, for example, is one who holds that position, that God would not leave a rational species alone without a divine self-manifestation about God and God's love. So I put people in two camps. I tend towards the atonement view. That is
that the latter
Christ
view
does work, as opposed to the revelation view. But I find it interesting that, you can find some really good thinkers who come down on both sides. Now, I'm going to bet, Josh, you tell me if I'm wrong, I'll bet you're a single incarnationist.
Well,
relying on the atoning work, but you correct me if I misjudged.
Is that, just to clarify, you would tend towards the single incarnation or the
I do,
multiple?
yes.
Okay, I would. My instinct would be that in order for all of this to work, I'm thinking, if, let's say, there's another civilization that's so far away that we have no contact and probably won't for a long time. I would imagine that in order for, let's say they were image bearers of God and they had that status just the same as we did, that either there would have to be some kind of either a simultaneous revelation to where either it's at the same time actually temporally, or through, because for God time is, immaterial really. He could do it whatever way he wanted. But I would imagine that God would have to be revealed to them, like you have said that a lot of people believe that he would have to reveal to those rational beings. And I would think that if there was no way that they could be expected to contact the civilization that did receive that revelation, then I would think naturally that he would have found a way to reveal himself to them. Whether that where it gets tricky for me is that an effectual salvation, or sacrifice for the atonement of sins? Would he have to sacrifice himself twice in two different planets? Because it would seem to me like it wouldn't be a very fun job to be Jesus, to be that part of the Trinity, that constantly having to sacrifice yourself for
Trinity, yes, die again and again. Yeah.
Got the rough end of the bargain there, being the one that is being sacrificed for. Well, I'm sure in his infinite love he would do that willingly, but it would be, I would find it hard to believe that there could be multiple sacrifices for multiple planets, and there would be a slightly better plan than that, and I guess it leads as well to the idea of multiple Edens at the beginning, perhaps, multiple creation stories. Do you think there's a possibility that an alien race could have a whole different lore and backstory and oral tradition?
Well, one observation that I think is relevant here is that in the Bible we have lots of revelations of God to somebody that have nothing to do with the incarnation. Moses had a revelation before the burning bush. The prophets would reveal God's word to the king from time to time. Even Balaam's donkey spoke on behalf of God. So I think that God would not find it difficult to engage in divine self-revelation in other species, and there's no way to tell, but I wonder if the dolphins know about God. I don't actually have an answer for that, but I don't think God would have a difficult task in making that happen. So I tend to separate incarnation from revelation and understand the logic as to why those theologians who connect revelation and incarnation then come up with a multiple incarnation point of view. The reason I think relying on the atoning work of Jesus Christ supports a single incarnation is that this forgiveness of sins, this promise, God's promise of resurrection to everlasting life, that's ontological. That changes the laws of nature.
Right.
And, most scientists assume, and I think it's very reasonable to assume, the laws of nature are the same everywhere in the cosmos. So, if what Jesus has done is introduce a new law of nature, namely the dead rise, that is going to obtain for the natural world everywhere. And so that's what makes me think I tip on the side of the one incarnation here. And when you think about missionaries over the last few centuries, or even going back to the New Testament, basically the missionary tells everybody what God has done.
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
The missionary doesn't redo it. And I once had to address a Baptist seminary in Georgia.
Oh, that sounds fun.
And one of the professors stands up, "Yes, our missionaries are packing their suitcases. We're ready to go."
Well, I hadn't thought of that, in that way of being, missionaries to the universe as well as on this. Because following on from what you said, the thing that was sticking in my mind is, I agree with what you said, that obviously it would be, that the incarnation here would affect the universe regardless. Like you said, it changes the laws of nature. But the thing that stuck for me is that we would end up with a much better understanding of this idea of grace and forgiveness of sins, and these kind of, even the fact that Jesus being the ultimate example for humans, that would be a lot of information revealed to us, but not to other worlds. And I guess it would rely on this idea of being missionaries to the universe, really, in order to spread that. And I suppose it's a pretty common thought to think of aliens as gods. A lot of ancient civilizations believe that, and this idea of like the aliens would come down and being divine messengers, and perhaps on another planet somewhere else, that's how they would see us, sharing our message with them.
Right.
Which is, but I hadn't thought of this idea of being, a missionary. So that definitely makes things, a lot easier to understand. And I would have assumed that you probably would have been on the side of the multiple incarnations. Not for any.
Most of my good friends are.
Yeah, not for any reason other than that. I just assumed that's what the logical, perhaps that the majority opinion would have been. And do you find there's a lot of variation in belief and ideas around this?
Well, at this particular point, every time I find a theologian or even a pastor who has an opinion on this, I kind of file it,
Mm-hmm.
The number's not large. Probably numbers in the dozens rather than in the thousands. And so at this particular point, I think the conversation is pretty well contained. We know what the parameters are. We know what the theological logic is. And I'm talking about very conscientious people who are trying to think through the implications. I don't think the matter is settled, even though we have some really good opinions. I don't think the matter is settled. Getting back to Paul Tillich, a half century ago, he said, if God is a God of grace, we can't expect God to leave those aliens alone. God is going to visit them as an act of grace and help them to understand themselves as creatures of a gracious God. And so I don't think this is a point we need to worry about, even though I do think we need to think about it. So,
Yeah, that's actually where I was kind of heading with that. Is this an issue that you think more people should be concerned about or thinking about on the whole?
Don't lose any sleep over it.
That's fair enough. So it's not a matter, like a first order of importance
right.
issue.
I don't think so. And when you look at those who want to shock us into thinking that it's Satan behind all of this, that their underlying motive is the old literal Bible versus Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which in principle has got almost nothing to do with this topic. So that's one of the reasons why, in my mind, I pushed them to the margins. Yeah. However, I want to pick up on something you were hinting at earlier. And there is a widespread belief rippling through our culture that aliens are godlike, or they're technological angels, and or a secular theology that says they're more highly evolved. Not only are they more intelligent than we are, they're more moral than we are.
Okay.
And if they're coming to Earth, they're coming to Earth to deliver salvation. So salvation comes in two forms. Number one, peace on Earth so that we don't destroy ourselves through thermonuclear war. A lot of experiencers who communicate with aliens will report that message. The second is the ecological challenge. They don't want to see Earthlings destroy themselves through ecological damage. So I would say if I were one of those who wanted to say UFOs are dangerous, I would say that's the danger.
Well, it's an optimistic view of aliens for sure, that they would be benevolent, in all their ways.
It really is, yeah. And at this point, there's no justification for it. Maybe, maybe they are. I don't want to deny that, but we're always, as the humans, we're always looking for substitute salvations. And aliens driving flying saucers could become a substitute savior.
Yeah.
It sounds silly, but I really think that for some, that's what's going on. And that's where I think the prophetic caution, don't believe in a false Christ or a false Messiah. Has a rightful place.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and that there's a lot of theological implications there, in terms of the idea that there could be other created beings that would not have the sinful nature, perhaps. Maybe Christians fall less prey to this idea of the aliens from on high coming to save the civilization, but that's the first thing I thought of, is that, surely there would be an issue with, from a Christian perspective, with other beings not having a sinful fallen nature.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. C.S. Lewis experimented with that idea in his space trilogy. And then he ended up having humans going to Venus and taking sin and contaminating the innocent. I find it difficult because of the relationship between human sinning on the one hand and our biological need to survive on the other. I have noticed, maybe other people have too, that if you look at medieval art on hell, what do you get? You get a big mouth with teeth.
Yep.
And you and I go through the mouth into hell. I've even seen it in Chinese Buddhism. The big mouth is on a dragon. Well, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you say, well, every animal's got to eat. And eating wreaks violence. For those of us who are not vegetarians, there are animals that have to die for us. And so what I have not sorted out clearly in my own mind is this relationship between violence and just plain survival. And when it comes to human sinning, I think the key identifier of a human sin is justifying the violence, saying the violence is good.
Right, yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And so it's hard for me to imagine a sinless society on another planet that eats.
Well, it's a metaphor as well for consumption of resources, I suppose you could say, and just the devouring of, in terms of greed and, I mean, we see ecological disasters that are as a result of negligence and all that kind of stuff. So there could be something to that, to where it's the perhaps being left to the consuming, human nature that devours, all things. So that's definitely, again, another interesting perspective on that.
Right.
And seeing as you brought up that kind of idea of the hell and demonic kind of imagery, let's just think for a second about the whole idea that this could be some kind of demonic, plan to fool us and to cause us to stumble. I would say I've heard that potentially more than any other reason, against alien life, is that that it would have to be, because it's so because there's no prior evidence in the Bible, like you said at the start, that it would have to be something that Satan is using to cause us to stumble. And I'm not sure I've heard it being linked to evolution in that regard before. So that's an interesting perspective in its own right. But definitely that this idea that aliens coming down would be to kind of have a destabilizing effect on the worldview of Christians, and I guess going to Revelation, where a lot of signs and wonders, and even the idea that workers of Satan could be clothed in light and all that kind of stuff. Do you see that as a valid way of looking at things, or to you is that more of like an ignorant perspective when you consider all things?
Well, certainly not the latter. I think you're right in pointing to symbols where Satan comes disguised as a wolf in sheep's clothing, so that enlightenment, when the serpent is tempting Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, don't you want to know what God knows? And so there are these ways in which Satan can sweet talk us into believing in alternatives, and I was trying to give an example of saying, gee, if we believe that in technological progress, and these aliens are more progressive than we are, then they can save us from our own weaknesses. I would say I'm more worried about that being a satanic temptation, I think, than what I see on the websites of those who have that particular interpretation. I think Christians are always asked by St. Paul to discern the spirits, because something can look really good.
Right.
And it looks like a sheep, but hidden behind it is the wolf. And I think we'll have to do that on Earth, but we'll have to do that with our new alien friends when we meet them too, is probably discern the spirits, and it might not be easy.
Would you say you're optimistic at the thought of there being life out there beyond the human race?
I'm optimistic. That doesn't mean I have evidence that other people don't have, but I definitely am optimistic. Why? Well, our whole Christian tradition has agreed that if God creates something, it's good. And so even if it comes to us in ambiguous form, we can use it either for good or evil. Down at the bottom, it's good. And I think, so that's a good theological reason for having positive expectations about meeting other intelligent creatures in space rather than, oh no, they're coming to kill us.
Yeah, and on the flip side, would you be disappointed if there weren't any aliens out there?
I would really be disappointed. That's just, and this is strictly personal. I want to meet them.
Right.
I really do. I hope that they're there. I don't want to mistake them for angels, but I certainly look forward favorably simply because I just love big things.
Yeah. And have you done any work towards that end of, supporting the work of people who are out there searching, and have you had any
I do.
involvement in that?
I have friends at SETI, and I just love engaging them in conversation and rooting for their success. Find us some new neighbors.
Yeah. Of the things you've heard and seen, is there anything that has, given you reason to be hopeful that there might be something out there? Have you seen any kind of evidence that in your mind kind of just, tilts the balance in the favor?
Well, this is a really complicated question, because what counts as evidence? So if I'm dealing with my friends at NASA and SETI, evidence for them fits in a tiny little box. It has to meet all kinds of rigorous scientific criteria. And so they say uniformly, we do not have empirical evidence to date that there are other living creatures of any type in the universe. The people in the UFO community, we got evidence all over the place. And, just talk to so-and-so. So I've interviewed many experiencers who have had close encounters of the third kind, and I listen very carefully, trying to bracket out the reality question. And they are convinced that it's true. I used to do UFO investigations in Louisiana, and I had a detective agency who could do psychological stress evaluation. So you could even take a tape recording of someone talking, put it on the PSE, and tell whether they're lying or not. I have to tell you that many of these people, they passed the PSE test,
Wow.
and so you have to say they believe what they're saying.
They had an experience of some sort.
Yeah, so like I say, weighing the evidence, that's there's no easy answer to that, and I tend to like the more rigorous scientific approach. But on the other hand, I don't want to say these people are kooky or crazy if they're reporting a very powerful experience in their life, and that suggests very strongly that we do have neighbors in space.
I wasn't aware that you were an investigator of these things. Was that for the government or police?
MUFON. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which over the decades has emerged as one of the best in terms of investigation, and then creating a file with the data that's in it. I don't do that anymore, but I did for a while.
So what is the process of interviewing someone that has had an experience?
Well, I had a little form. I would sit them down, turn on my tape recorder, explain what's going to happen. I had a bunch of questions. If they could draw a picture, that would be good. And I was interviewing a mother and son. He was 12, and they had a UFO within 500 feet followed them for 20 minutes on the highway, and then they went home. And I was there the day after, and the son drew a picture of the craft and this, that, and the next thing. And I told them, I've got my tape recorder now, and I'm going to have it tested at the detective agency. Got a phone call the next day from the mother.
Yep.
Did you have the tape tested yet? No, not yet. Well, there's a lie on there. Oh, I said, and what was that? She said, I told you that I'm 32. I'm actually 34.
But still convinced of all the other stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah, she had no compunction about the other things that she was saying. So.
just lying about her age. Well, I guess that was a great relief for you that you.
Oh yeah, right.
But so that's interesting. Did you find that people often drew the stereotypical gray and the flying saucer with a little bubble on top?
Yes, I did, and that suggests a cultural trope that's out there in the culture, and we expect them to look like that, and they end up looking like that. But I don't want to reduce it to something that lacks sincerity, you know.
It can either go one of two ways: either that's really what they look like because everyone thinks they look like that, and
right.
or that it's like you said, a cultural development. What were some of the strangest stories that you heard from people of these encounters? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you have a couple memorable ones.
All right. Well, here's one that I still think about. Two firemen, and they're in the bayous of Louisiana. They're hunting nutria late at night. Nutria are kind of like beavers or something like that.
Never heard of
so
those.
they're sitting in their boat with a gasoline motor and talking with each other, and this light looks like a star at first, starts to descend, gets bigger and bigger, and finally it settles only 70 feet above the boat. It bathes the boat in light. And even though the outboard motor is still going, the boat's not moving. And they discover their bodies are paralyzed. And they try to talk with each other. And Captain Pinky was in the front. And Captain Pinky says, well, let's shoot it with a shotgun. He says, I can't move my arms. And so this went on for some 20 minutes. They're able to talk, but they're actually paralyzed in suspended animation. Then it flies away. So they come back, and they go home, and I'm there again the next day. It's wonderful. Well, what did you see? Bright light. Oh.
That's
and,
specific.
what do you think it was? Don't know. And they really had no language to describe what it was, so I had to keep picking and picking in order to get it figured out. All right, a week later, I go back for another interview, and all the neighbors are there. And their wives have just read, 3 or 4 flying saucer books. So I asked them the question, well, what do you think it was? It was a spaceship. Oh, a spaceship.
Yeah.
Well, who was it piloted by? Well, extraterrestrials. They had the whole, I would call it a myth. That doesn't, I don't want to insult anybody, but
Yeah.
the whole myth now becomes the filter for interpreting an experience which originally they couldn't explain.
They've constructed it.
Yeah, and then to top it all off, went back one more time. It was a Sunday afternoon. I went to the firehouse, took my son who could climb on the fire trucks and stuff like that. Now Captain Pinky says has visions of his dead mother talking to him, sitting on the fender of the fire truck. So now you're into the paranormal.
And the spiritual realm.
Watch the growth of an experience you couldn't explain to extraterrestrials, and now into paranormal experiences. I could see it right before my eyes.
Yeah.
And I want to say, how does that happen?
And was that a common thing that people would try to find ways to explain what they had encountered?
I think it is a common phenomenon. I do. And I can't measure its significance. So that's one of the reasons why I use the word cultural quite frequently.
Right.
It's not your individual experience, but it's your individual experience interpreted through the lenses of the surrounding culture. And let me just ask an observation, Josh. I can't really give you why it happens this way. I'd like to, but that's the way it is. I myself am not an experiencer, so I have to simply try to listen carefully to those people who report experiences.
Yeah, and discern what they might have gone through.
Yeah.
Would you say that there were many that were actually convincing, or were most of them kind of just hard to?
Some were quite convincing, and others cockamamie. Yeah, there's no question there are a lot of kooks that make you giggle.
Of course,
there are enough really serious, rational people who've had extraordinary experiences that I just want to say that they have a certain amount of integrity.
Yeah.
But, once you think rationally about UFO reports and whether or not we're talking about extraterrestrial visitors, then it gets kind of screwy, because even though you have a dominant close encounter of the third kind with the gray, there are 4 or 5 other species, one of which is the insectoid.
Okay.
Large grasshopper, praying mantis.
Wow.
And you could just feel culturally there's something sort of evil and dangerous going on here.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for me to take something like that literally. And then there's another alien who is a tall, handsome man that looks like a Scandinavian. That's my wife's favorite alien.
I'm sure.
And so, you have to use categories such as myth, I think, in order to try to put these things together. That doesn't mean there isn't some authentic experience underneath, but all the cultural manifestations I have to put in the category of myth. And one of the most highly respected investigators is named Jacques Vallée in Silicon Valley, and he also sees these mythical dimensions, and then he tries to connect it with pre-modern experiences with fairies and things like that. Let me just say I haven't gone there myself, but there are some who see these mythical structures at work, which only makes it more difficult. And the scientists at SETI or NASA, boy, they don't want to have anything to do with myth.
Yeah, and
in fact, if they can get away from cultural tropes in general, they want to. So that only makes it more complicated, the public conversation much more complicated. And I think the theologian needs to understand that complication and then speculate. We have to speculate because, you don't have conclusive empirical evidence for the things that you want to talk about.
Yeah, you got to unpick all of that and sort of come to, a reasoned conclusion. And speaking of, these kind of cultural tropes, I know you mentioned about your wife favors the Scandinavian one, but do you have a favorite kind of cultural depiction of extraterrestrials that you would?
I really do. Yes, I do. I think that there are only 2 authentic UFO movies. The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. All the others are science fiction.
Okay.
Now, the message in the 1951 movie where Klaatu is standing on the flying saucer talking to the scientific community, so important that the scientists represent the world, and in the movie we found the politicians couldn't. So he's talking to the scientists about what extraterrestrial civilization looks like, and he's warning us against nuclear war. 1951. Okay.
Yeah.
Robert Oppenheimer's still alive.
Right.
at this juncture. Well, okay, now that's a movie. By 1952, 53, 54, you've got UFO cults developing, religious organizations centered around a shaman, and the shaman is the one who had the UFO experience, and the message is the same as Klaatu. Stop nuclear weapons testing.
Right.
You know? And that really was the dominant point of view. And so I getting back to the Satan thing, and I don't want to overstate this, I think what's coming to expression here is this deep human realization we cannot save ourselves.
Yep.
We are on the brink of self-destruction through nuclear weapons. We cannot save ourselves. And these more highly technologically advanced aliens are coming. They can save us from self-destruction. So you see a kind of messianism
Right. Yeah.
at work there. And of course, these cult leaders, they were attuned
Right.
to dimensions. And so getting back to Satan again, and I don't want to overstate this, but Satan is appealing to you and my goodness. Of course we want world peace.
He can jump on that.
Yeah, of course we want to do that. And how are we going to get it? Well, technological progress. That's how we're going to get it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, so that actually has been kind of one of my central concerns all along. And I think the shift to ecology in the late 1980s, early 1990s was actually a cultural shift rather than, I don't think the space aliens changed much, but their concern really had to do with ecology. And I don't know if you've looked at the work of John Mack or not from that period.
I haven't.
And he was a psychiatrist at Harvard. He did in-depth interviews of UFO abductees. And that's what he reported, that the aliens had communicated to them that we need to protect our planet from self-destruction. And it's interesting that the aliens had the same view of the world that John Mack himself.
Yeah, that they happen to follow the predominant cultural fear of the time of the apocalyptic, end of world scenario, whether it's nuclear war, climate crisis. It seems like the aliens are kind of in tune with whatever's in vogue at that time.
What our anxiety is, they speak to it.
Well, I would say that I have a soft spot for Independence Day as a movie that I love. I don't know it may not be as profound as some other movies, but I just maybe it's that kind of longing to be an American and have the American patriotism inside me from afar.
Right. Well, that theme will always sell and etc. But I would say that even though it's an exciting movie because the good guys win, it doesn't actually fit the UFO phenomenon. I think the UFO phenomenon looks differently than what Independence Day suggests.
What about Mars Attacks? Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
It's certainly an interesting film. It was I think it was it Tim Burton or someone like that directed it. It's very surreal. It's that these aliens come down and they look like they have these bubble domes and their brains kind of sticking out of their heads, and they come down and looks like they're they keep saying that they come in peace, and then they start blasting everybody, and it's very surreal where I think in the end, Tom Jones saves the world with an Elvis record being played over a gramophone that explodes their brains. And
I've got to watch it. Mars Attacks, it's called.
Mars Attacks, yeah, and they're little Martians, that come down.
I like Elvis. If Elvis could save the world, I'm happy. With
it was either Elvis or maybe it was Hank Williams, but it was like one of these kind of crooning records from played on a gramophone, and for some reason it resonated their brains and exploded. But it's a crazy movie. But yeah, Tom Jones, who would have thought he would have been involved in the saving the world? But that's a good note to end on. And it's like I said, I feel like I say this in every episode, that we feel like we could go on talking for a long time about all the details and the ins and outs of this. But what I really loved hearing was that theological perspective of and it was interesting to hear that the majority of people didn't feel like it would be a crisis for their faith. So that certainly was enlightening for me in that regard. But I want to say thanks for coming on and you talking about this, because as you said at the start, it's something that we need to talk about, and it's certainly a hot button cultural issue. So I appreciate your time and for shedding some light on some of these topics.
Well, thank you, Josh, for pursuing it, and keep talking about topics that we shouldn't be talking about.
Absolutely, that's one thing I can promise to do on this channel. But unfortunately, that's it for this week. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in to watch. I appreciate each one of you who's watching, and please be sure to subscribe to this channel for more content like this. And please comment below your thoughts. Do you believe that aliens can coexist with our theology, or are you a little more skeptical? Put your comments below and give a like on this video if you enjoyed it. But that's all for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you again next week. It would be a crime if I didn't ask your opinion on why we're seeing so much alien stuff coming out at this point in time.
Yes, it is a fact that we've had a real spike in interest in UFOs, aliens, and what's called the Disclosure Project, to get the U.S. government to disclose what it has in the secret files